Hi there, it's Larold, and now that I've finished up all of the class-specific tank previews, I wanted to do a nice wrap-up video. I'll touch on what I feel are the most important changes to tanking across the board in BFA, the biggest thing changing for each class specifically, and just kind of where each class is headed so far in the beta, and then go over any major changes that have been made to classes since I made their respective videos. Let's dive in. First off, I've mentioned this in each of the tank videos, but it bears repeating because it's a big transition for the game that's kind of flown in under the radar. Primary stat, so agility or strength depending on whether you wear leather or plate, is a direct damage reduction stat. For Brewmasters it increases their stagger percentage, and for the other 5 tanks, they each have a way to directly convert it into armor. While armor has diminishing returns, this is a pretty solid improvement to how all tanks will prioritize itemization and gearing in BFA. Gone are the days of passing on a 10 item level upgrade because the secondary stats are bad. This is just a really good change that I'm very excited about. Related to that, one of the biggest issues with tank balance in Legion, and even stretching all the way back to Mists of Pandaria, is that tank active mitigation uptime was a really big factor in overall tank performance. Basically, tanks like DK, Monk, and Druid who can maintain 100% uptime on their AM are just way safer and more reliable than tanks who can't. While uptime doesn't really seem like it's changing in BFA, because of the primary stat conversions into armor, Blizzard has done a much better job of making it clear that lower uptime active mitigation spells are going to be way stronger than ones with high uptime. Here's a good comparison. Bone Shield uptime will still be around 100%, and it converts 40% of strength into armor. Not bad. Shield of the Righteous uptime with reasonable haste values will probably only be about 35%. To compensate, it grants 150% of strength as armor. That's a huge difference. And while it may not make lower AM uptime classes better in situations like Mythic Dungeons where you're constantly tanking a bunch of mobs, it should certainly help to close the gap a little bit. Finally, most of the classes haven't changed much, and Blizzard explicitly stated at the beginning of the BFA alpha that this was intentional. They like where classes are at this point in Legion, and they want to keep a lot of things the same. For the most part, that's okay. Legion tanking is pretty good, and while there's always room for improvement, particularly in terms of cleaning up some of the weaker talents, the classes are decently balanced, aside from DK being way too strong in Mythic Dungeons. Alright, on to class-specific stuff. Rather than going alphabetically, I'm just going to start with Warrior. Because Warriors have had more changes than the other 5 tanks combined, they're going to get a little extra attention. Ignore Pain's been revamped and reworked, and removed, and returned, and reworked some more. It's on the global cooldown now, so it's not particularly convenient to use anymore. And at its current tuning, it's primarily just a button to hit if you desperately need some damage reduction, or you want to prevent spell damage, or you're getting up to 100 rage and you'd rather spend it on something defensive than revenge. It is the one damage reduction tool across all 6 tanks that directly prevents spell damage, so that is a pretty sizable advantage for warriors that helps compensate for their lack of real self-healing. Alright, I'm popping in here to say that as I was finishing this video up, Blizzard released some significant changes to warrior talents. First off, Bolster, the effective but irritating to use rage-spending armor increase, has been redesigned. It's now a cooldown reduction to last stand that makes you block capped while it's active. It's not a bad defensive cooldown, but it is still in a tier with a constant 10% health increase, so it's probably not good enough to beat that out. Never Surrender was revamped from a block chance increase, to an Ignore Pain increase that works a lot like Live. The design is still okay, but the current tuning on Ignore Pain means that it probably won't be better than Indomitable. Finally, Dragon Roar was added into the 3rd tier. It's okay, it's kind of like 2 Thunderclaps at once, but it doesn't generate rage or do anything to reset Shield Slam. Meh. Overall, the biggest change to Warriors is by far the redesign of their rage generation. Rage generation is down significantly, and the class's defensive playstyle is very different from the Ignore Pain spam fest it is in Legion. The offense is very similar, although Warriors probably won't be using Devastator, at least to start out the expansion. Overall, the design of Warriors feels slower, but beefier and better at preventing incoming damage than it has been in Legion. Demon Hunter is probably the second most changed class. Their 2 biggest changes are that Demon Spikes no longer has a pain cost, which makes it much easier to use, and that the self-healing from soul fragments is now based on damage taken within the last 5 seconds, like DK. These are two really nice changes that make the class feel a little bit easier to play and a lot more rewarding when you play it well. Demon Hunter has definitely been the most surprisingly good class on the beta for me. Death Knight hasn't undergone a ton of base class changes on the beta, but their talents have gotten a rework, and their playstyle is changed up a good bit. The talent rework has added the potential to run Runestrike and Tombstone in order to generate more resources. The DK video was the first one I made in the series, and since then Ossuary has been changed back to its current Legion incarnation, which is pretty good and may take away from using Tombstone. We'll just have to see on that one. Druid has consistently been one of the safest tanks for the past several expansions, and that doesn't seem like it's going to change. Its rage generation has been increased slightly, and it's received several modest buffs to base abilities to compensate for losing artifact traits. Mangle deals proportionally more damage on BFA than it does on Live, and the rotation will once again be oriented more around casting Mangle on cooldown instead of focusing on Thrash. Overall, Druids are the same? They're tanky, they're a little boring, they're great. Brewmaster have undergone probably the least amount of serious changes of any tanks in BFA. The recharge time for brews has been reduced by 5 seconds to compensate for losing the artifact weapon, but the most notable change is definitely losing legendaries. For the other 5 tanks, legendaries are like hair gel. They change how you look and feel a little bit, but going without them isn't too big of a deal. For brewmasters, it's more like a visit to the local mad scientist to get 6 robot arms sewn onto your body. After you've lived life as an octopus, man, it's weird to go back to just being a regular 2 arms. Weirdness aside, Brewmaster is still pretty good. They're mobile, they're great at taking burst damage. It's all the stuff you knew from before, with a rotation that's a little stripped down and feels incomplete. Hopefully talent changes in the coming months will round out the rotation and make it feel a little bit more full. Pally's up last, and this shouldn't come as any surprise, I guess, but less than 36 hours after releasing my Paladin recap video, Blizzard has made some big changes to the class. I'd already recorded my section in this video about how not much had changed, and then I saw these changes, so I guess it's not true anymore. So here's what's new. Consecration will no longer buff the value of Shield of the Righteous and Light of the Protector. Instead, Avenger Shield will buff your next Shield of the Righteous by 20%. Additionally, the Pally Mastery will grant damage reduction while standing in your Consecration, instead of increasing your Shield of the Righteous's effectiveness. Finally, Consecration will have a much shorter cooldown and a much longer duration, making it way easier to use. This set of changes is great. It addresses a lot of problems that Pally's had, including some things I said in the class preview, and it will make the class easier to play and more consistent. Shield of the Righteous will still be a very powerful active mitigation when it's up, and Pally's will have better defensive tools to cover their butts when it's down. Pally's got an unexpected change today too. Blizzard had stated they would replace the level 15 talent Consecrated Hammer, which isn't that great now, and really wouldn't do anything after all these changes were implemented. But they didn't say what they would be replacing it with. Well, Christmas came early, and here's a new level 15 talent for Pally's. It's worth noting, since it's not clear from the tooltip, that this is 75% block value, not chance. So while it's not mind-blowingly overpowered, it's still a pretty good damage reduction talent, and we'll just have to see how it stacks up to the other 2 options. Alright, that's it for the class-specific stuff, and I just have one final point on BFA tanking. One of the most common criticisms I've seen, and it's one I've voiced a whole bunch myself too, is that tanking feels slower. It's slowed down, there's not as much room for skill, it's worse, so on. I've looked back in some of my notes and criticisms of past expansions, and this is actually something I said of beta tanking in Legion and Warlords, and tanking wound up being really good in those expansions. The initial push into the expansion, usually all the way up through the first raid instance, can be fairly punishing for tanks. But then things just sorta come back around, and you start feeling like a big tough tank with a lot of control over your survival. I have every reason to expect that this will happen again in BFA. And with the continued growth and development of Mythic Dungeons, and new content like Island Expedition and Warfronts, BFA seems like it's going to have even more content than Legion where tanks can really make an impact. Well, I think that about covers it. If you want deeper dives on any of the tank classes, check out the corresponding preview videos. If you have any questions about tanks or tanking in BFA, ask away. I will be covering tank updates as they come along, so stay tuned for more great BFA beta content, and as always, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye!